Welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz Podcast. Thanks for joining us today on our first episode of 2023. So happy New Year to you. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined by Josh Sullivan.
Hello.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm joined over here by Matt Van Milligan.
Hello.
Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year.
So we begun a new year, which is always exciting, right? But in our life, in the life of the Catholic Church, on the final day of 2022, on December 31st, we heard the news of the death of Pope Benedict XVI. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of really has clouded some of the celebrations of the end of the new year, or the end of the old year and the beginning of the new year, like especially because, you know, at the end of the old year, beginning of the new year, we always celebrate the solemnity of Mary, Mother of God. So obviously the celebrations at the Vatican, the celebrations in parishes across the world, it was a little bit clouded because of the death of Pope Benedict, and rightfully so. Right. So today I think all three of us have mourned the loss of Pope Benedict. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Pope Benedict and his contributions to the church. Mm-hmm. And hopefully maybe at one point we could share our own short, if that's possible, a personal story of how Pope Benedict affected maybe our life, you know, because he was the Pontiff between 2005 and 2013, which means we were in our 20s.
Yeah.
In our 20s.
Yeah, he was the Pope when I became Catholic.
There you go.
Yeah.
He was the Pope when I went to the seminary to study for the priesthood. Yeah. So maybe we each have a little personal story. But first, obviously, we knew, especially this year, like I've been following a little bit of news on Pope Benedict, that his health was declining.
That's right.
And you, every once in a while on Instagram, I'd see pictures of him with someone, or even I think Pope Francis, you know, give credit to Pope Francis, would visit him quite often. And you'd see the fragility, the frailty of his face and his body recently. And so when we got news, sort of in between Christmas and New Year's, you know, Pope Francis had announced, please pray for Pope Benedict because he's not doing well. I think we all kind of knew that the Lord was calling him home.
And it was 95.
95.
Right? Like that's a pretty good long life. You know what I mean? If I can only live to 95, I'll be happy.
Yeah, exactly. So we're not going to give like a biographical episode on Pope Benedict. There's lots of places people can find a biography about Pope Benedict, but just some highlights of his life I think that are important. One, that, you know, he was one of the greatest theologians of our modern day.
Yeah.
You know, and so he started his career as a theologian. And from that was moved to the Vatican by John Paul II, where you know he was made a cardinal when he was the Archbishop of Munich, and became the prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. Was sort of a side by side with John Paul II. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
then was elected Pope. Of course, people remember him for his announcement that he was resigning from the papacy in 2013. And then he spent the last 9 years really in sort of a prayerful support of the church. And I can't wait. Maybe he's written things over those 9-year period that haven't been released yet, or I don't know. I can't wait to see. So let's kind of go through some of the things that we can highlight about Pope Benedict, because I think, you know, his funeral was last week, and it was a simple funeral. The Vatican said that was his request.
Yeah, he asked for that.
Simple funeral. So you didn't see all the pomp and circumstance of like a sitting pope, if you would, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, even with the representatives from different countries, like official delegations from other countries, only Italy and Germany was allowed or invited for official delegations. You know, and maybe the simplicity of the funeral kind of raised my eyebrow a bit. Yeah. You know, like still, this was a man who was the pontiff of the church. Just because he wasn't the sitting pontiff doesn't mean that there couldn't have been a greater sort of celebration, right? Like, let's say, for example, a former prime minister of Canada or a former president of the United States. You know, just because they're not in office, you know, it's still a big to do.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of who he was as a person, right? Like
It makes sense. Like his demeanor was, he wasn't as, you would say charismatic as JP2, or maybe even as extroverted as you might expect a pope to be. He was like up until he became pope, or maybe you would say up until he was appointed to kind of the Roman Curia itself, he was kind of a shy academic, or like that was his background, and he would lecture to a group of students, but addressing that St. Peter's Square, like, and
it's a different thing,
and the kind of public figure
that the Pope is.
Yeah, the Pope is expected to be.
Pope,
he always seemed a little bit uncomfortable in that role, so
sure.
it fits if that was actually his request. That it be,
Sure, that's true. And I like how, he is like a shy sort of academic, but, reading the stories in the past week about people who have been reflecting on the life of Pope Benedict, so many people saying that in their studies, or even living in Rome, where he was a cardinal at the time, they would just, all these high up sort of Vatican position people sort of whisked here and whisked there, and here's Cardinal Ratzinger just kind of walking with his briefcase in his hand through
very
St.
simple
Peter's Square, and people approach him, and he stops and
with his red shoes
speaks to them and things, So I think there's a humility there that we can obviously see. Okay, then I wasn't going to talk about this right now, but since it's you sort of brought it up, like this humility of Pope Benedict, I think for me shines through. However, as Pope Benedict, people sort of classified him or marked him to be some sort of like powerhouse person who came down hard and conservative leaning, and sort of portrayed him as sort of a mean old character, right? I don't know if you've watched the movie on Netflix, The Two Popes.
No,
have you seen that movie?
No, I haven't seen the full thing.
So many people say to me, "Father, have you seen the movie The Two Popes?" And yes, I just don't like it. I don't like it. I don't like it. And people say, "Why? I love that movie." And I think one of the reasons why I don't like it is because they portray Pope Benedict as sort of this complainer, as sort of this person who doesn't know what to do with the task he has, and he's sort of crusty about the shape of the world, and here comes Pope Francis to save the day. You know what I mean? And that's, of course, it's Hollywood and whatever, but I think that's part of the reason I don't like it. But so why does this man who's humble, who just served the church with his whole life, why does he get portrayed as someone like that?
Yeah, I would say that different popes have different priorities, and the office of pope itself involves taking responsibility for a number of different things within the Vatican, and you're a moral teacher. You're also responsible for kind of administrating the Roman Curia. You're also responsible for kind of the public relations. So there are all kinds of aspects of pope that different popes have done to different degrees of success. I think what Pope Benedict brought to the papacy was theological clarity, clear moral teaching, and an intellectual generosity that I think a lot of people miss. That there are a bunch of anecdotes that would support that, but not personal anecdotes. But but that's the way that a lot of people come to that is it's like, okay, clear teaching on moral matters, that they kind of just caricature him as this kind of browbeating, you're doing the wrong thing kind of person. But the full range of what he actually did, of what he actually offered, a lot of people right now, starting this year, are starting the Father Mike Schmidt's Catechism in the Year.
Right.
They don't realize that, while JP2 was still the Pope in the late 80s, commissioned, authoring the Catechism of the Catholic Church, having a clear picture of what the Church teaches, a summary, and as it says in the introduction, a summary of Christian doctrine, that Benedict, for the most part, authored this kind of solo, and then was worked with JP2 to kind of finalize it and publish it and issue it through the church. But it's this is more of a giving a positive theology is the thing that's missed by a lot of people who want to kind of caricature him as this moral teacher or like just moral reprimander or like putting the church in line. He's like, no, this is the fullness of the teaching of the church. And sometimes that's missed by people who maybe just want to focus on just the moral, and this is what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. And
I think a lot of people too are taking with Vatican II and with all that stuff. We've talked about this before in the podcast, but there were steps taken or let's say leniencies towards what the Catholic Church was actually teaching at a time, because the Catholic Church now with Vatican II, this happened, and people were taking their ideas and their beliefs and putting them towards what Vatican II had changed, but that wasn't actually the case. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like someone, like, imagine a brother coming down and saying, hey, Mom said we can have a big party in the basement, we're going to invite all our friends over, and then while that party's happening, the next brother comes and said, no, she said we can have 2 friends over for the, no, I'm clarifying what she said here. It's looked at as the person coming in to spoil the party, but really what's happening is no, I'm laying down no, what's going on here is you guys took this and ran away with it. And that's not actually what the church teaches. The church teaches this. And so it can kind of sometimes look at what he was actually doing was clarifying, and what he was actually doing was putting us back on track and putting us back in our place, but the people that were just being willy-nilly with the faith, or just taking and making the faith something completely different, were being put back in line. And that's where I think a lot of times the media and the people that kind of taken well, he was saying this, but now Pope now reprimanded him, or whatever the case may be, never reprimand, but corrected him, and now the whole Catholic Church is more conservative than we really thought, or whatever. So
and I like that. I mean, your example there is Pope Benedict, one of the most intellectual people, and now it's resorted to this example of mom giving rules for a house party. But but I like what you said, because it's very true. Because during his papacy, but not only during his papacy, but through his theological teachings, like Matt, you mentioned the Catechism of the Catholic Church, right? This is all just to present more clarity. And I think if we're going to look at the papacy of Pope Benedict, that's what I have found so enriching about Pope Benedict, is that he has sort of found this way to deepen the conversation about things like moral truths. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. And I think we've taken that for granted. I think when you look back on his papacy and you sort of see whoa, he said some things here that have given us clarity for today, right? Yeah, and in as much as an intellectual he was, pretty simply, I would say, I mean, his texts are dense, accessibly, and long, accessibly, sure.
And it's interesting. People want to put him on this political continuum, that he was this, conservative browbeat, but he offered that precision, he offered that clarity in kind of correction of both ends of the political spectrum. He criticized and relativism and liberalism within the church. He also critiqued, these far-leaning, hyper-conservative, you would say, kind of factions within the church, and
it was bringing back on track from both sides. I agree.
And I think he did something that was very important also as a society, and not just as a church, is he was pointing out the fact that like you mentioned, relativism, where everything is just everything's the same, everything's relative sort of thing, right? But also this growing concern that he had with the denial of objective truth, right? And he was always pointing us back towards God is the way, the truth, and the life. And I think there was a beauty in that Pope Benedict was trying to encourage.
I heard a lot of people talk about how JP2 converted hearts, but Pope Benedict converted minds. And so it seemed really that the fact that they followed one after another really makes sense, because you got to first, you got to evangelize the heart, and then you can evangelize the mind. You got to be converted in your heart first, and then once you're converted in your heart, you can then start to grasp and understand and start to want to dig into your faith in a mind. You know what I mean? And so the fact that JP2 was who he was, and the charismatic figure that he was, and bringing people to love God and know Jesus and all that stuff. But then those people whose hearts were converted now got to intellectually dig into our faith and be able to actually use the ideas that Pope Benedict put forward to sculpt who they were as Catholics, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, very cool. And I'm just remembering now, obviously, Pope Benedict was elected in April of 2005 as Pope. And then later that same year, during the summer, it was World Youth Days in Cologne, Germany, and I was there. And when people talk about not being as charismatic as John Paul II or Pope Francis, I remember him leading this World Youth Days and people having real conversion of hearts listening to him speak,
words,
And I remember him talking to us, like he was saying, like, don't settle. Don't settle for what you're doing in your life. You're not called to be like everyone else. The Lord is calling you to greatness. And these young people were really looking to him with great admiration, but with this sense that, this man is speaking to our hearts, to me, And I remember too, because we were in Cologne, Germany. And if you've ever been to the cathedral in Cologne, Germany, beautiful Gothic structure. It's, I think, built in the 1600s, if I'm not mistaken. I toured it when we were there for World Youth Day. And the tradition is that in the sanctuary of this Cologne cathedral are the relics of the Magi that we just celebrated for the Epiphany.
Oh, interesting.
Right? And here it was in the middle of a warm, hot, like European summer in Germany. And Pope Benedict is talking to us about the Magi. And it was really cool because it wasn't the Epiphany, right? But here it was. And he was making the point that these people were following where God had set them on to a path. Yeah. And then when God sort of takes you on a journey, where you're going to end up might not be where you have thought. But God's plan comes to fulfillment. And I just remember listening to that in my own heart and being like, why not let the Lord guide our life? Obviously, the Magi are a good example of this because how did their, the gospel that we just read on the Epiphany, it's like, so they went on their path by a different road. Yeah. Obviously, if they've ended up in Cologne, Germany, the relics of their the relics there are in Cologne, Germany. They were on a different path, but it was the path that God had for them. And just the way he was instructed, this intellectual man speaking to the hearts of young people. It was just beautiful. It was a really graced moment. And I think that's what I love about Pope Benedict is that when you hear him speak, he's speaking to our hearts. There was a lot of graced moments where you were like, wow, the depth of this conversation is really touching more than just my ears. It's really making me reflect. It's making me interiorize what I'm hearing.
Yeah. I think the other thing that gets kind of passed by, and it kind of gets actually, I think, attributed to Pope Francis, but it's actually Pope Benedict that first started with Twitter. And started open news media from the Vatican, to give the news directly to the people and that kind of thing, and like the unofficial, I guess, but official news sources and stuff. And so connecting to the real world on that front. Now, and that might also be why, because now there's no second guessing or hearing through a third person or fourth person or fifth party of the, what the Pope said. It's direct. It's this is exactly what is being said. So there's no sugarcoating it, if that makes sense, or whatever. It's a direct line to exactly what's being portrayed and what's being, so people can hear it directly.
Yeah. And while we're on the subject of clarifying misconceptions, that it was just kind of like this removed academic from the concerns of real people, that he would regularly call different groups to the Vatican to have a discussion with them. I think it was 2012 or something like that, maybe earlier. He invited a bunch of poets and artists and to the Vatican to have a discussion and to address them specifically. But a lot of them were Catholic artists. Some of them were just well-known, you would say, kind of secular. It's like, you have a gift and you have an ability, pursue the good, the true, and the beautiful. So it's it's not just kind of this abstract intellectual project. It's like, no, in what you're doing, in what you're producing, you can participate in what God is doing, and you can demonstrate kind of the glory of God.
So Pope Benedict has written extensively.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
What's like you, Matt? You're the
Yeah.
most academic here around this table. What would you say were some of his influential writings for yourself, or things that you look to and say, "Wow, this was really helpful for me in my own faith formation"?
Okay, so I did actually bring a couple books, mostly because I like to walk around carrying books because it helps me, facilitate this image of myself.
Gives him a really good
yeah.
strong arm for like lifting weights and stuff.
No, and I started reading, Pope Benedict, but then kind of Cardinal Ratzinger well before I became Catholic. And the first book I read by him was Christianity and the Crisis of Cultures, which basically, I'm not going to summarize each of the books, but he talks about how, kind of historically and, within the intellectual tradition of the West, the further ideas, philosophies, cultures, civilizations got away from, the centrality of faith and the centrality of Christ. They lost, yes, in the case of like the Roman Empire, like they actually lost their cultures or their civilizations, but they, in many cases, lost what, makes them distinctly human. They lost their sense of human dignity. And it's like, he does a really, really good job kind of walking through those, those historical examples, but actually making the point of, how important faith really is. One of the books, again, before I became Catholic, he had a public debate with one of the, you would say, kind of the preeminent German philosophers of the time on, the basis of civilization. And he's like, what is a civilization without faith? And, I would say he kind of won that debate. But like for me, it was, at the time I was studying philosophy. I was interested in the church. And for me, it was, and I've said it on the podcast a few times, that, the intellectual tradition of the church doesn't shy away from the world. Like we're not scared of, ideas that are presented. We're not scared of philosophy. It's like, because the intellectual tradition of the church is a match for, kind of any idea that you'll find out there. And that's like, that was my experience studying philosophy and looking into Catholicism. But that's also kind of the historical experience of the church in the 20th century. That, we've talked about kind of Vatican II and like this, how does the church engage the modern culture, things like that. And then kind of the other book that was really influential for me was Spirit of the Liturgy, where he gives just a really good explanation of what liturgy is. And for me, I didn't know what liturgy was at all, but from a Protestant background, scripture was really important to me. And if you read any of his encyclicals, any of his books, they're so rich in kind of scriptural references. Like everything is footnoted. And there's a lot more to say about that, but I don't want to take over
and
time.
I think there's lots, like a lot of people have told me that Cardinal Ratzinger's book Introduction to Christianity is so mind-blowing and just life-giving for them. There's another book that we can recommend that people can read if they're looking on the for amazing things that Pope Benedict has written. So his intellectual contributions to the church, John Paul II names him in 1981 as the prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, one of the highest congregations, now the dicastery in the Vatican, and that's where he puts together the Catechism of the Catholic Church. That's where he's in this position to sort of, flesh out some of the teachings of the Catholic Church, which has been beautiful. So at the time of his election, really, Pope Benedict Cardinal Ratzinger wasn't expecting to be elected Pope. I mean, he presided over the funeral of John Paul II.
He was the dean of the cardinal.
That's right. And he also gave a homily in preparation for the conclave, and it's clear from what he said. You can go back and see what he wrote, what he was saying, that he wasn't thinking that he was going to be elected. Now he's elected the Holy Father, the Pope of the Catholic Church, and there's, aside from his intellectual contributions, I think some of the things that he's remembered for in his papacy are obviously some of the beautiful things that he wrote, but his encyclicals too, like his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, God is Love, released on Christmas Day. Released on Christmas Day of 2005, I believe, the first year that he was pontiff. But his encyclicals were really like also calling people to, as much as people say that he was a staunch sort of rule guy, like he was calling people to understand that God is love. That's the reason for all of this, that God loves us. And I think that's really beautiful. Some of the things that he'll be remembered for, I think, if I can just say them quickly, is he called people back to the celebration of the Tridentine Mass, of the Latin Mass. Now there's sort of restrictions on that with this current papacy, but Pope Benedict has allowed for sort of celebrations for that in the Latin Mass, which I think has helped sort of some people rediscover their faith or come to the faith. There was also this situation with the Anglican Church. Remember the Ordinariate, which Pope Francis established in 2011, where he has opened the doors for congregations of the Anglican Church to return to the Catholic Church while still maintaining some of their traditions. There's lots of people from that former tradition speaking about how that has helped them come into the Catholic Church. Then I would say that he also sort of had to tackle sort of the sexual abuse crisis in the church, right? And he's criticized. Whatever you do in that sort of capacity, you're going to be criticized. But he was the one that tackled it. I've heard him speak in many languages in many occasions, apologizing for the abuse that was. That people had to endure at the hands of some priests or members of the church. He was the one that laicized, I think the number was 800 priests. Like very quickly, he sort of sped up that process to like, no, you were not faithful to your calling here to the church. You're gone, sort of thing. Like he came down hard on those situations where I think we had not seen that before in the Catholic Church, right? I know that here in Canada, that Pope Benedict, in 2009, welcomed a delegation of Indigenous people to the Vatican, and where he expressed his sorrow and that he reiterated that acts of abuse cannot be tolerated. He called them deplorable, and he spoke with the Indigenous peoples of Canada back in 2009. People like Chief Edward John was there. People like Phil Fontaine, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, was there. And like people who were sort of moved by. I know Fontaine at the time said that what he had heard gave him great comfort. What he heard from Pope Benedict, that had not been seen before. I think from Pope Benedict's papacy, right? So there's a lot of things in what he has done as the pontiff that I think that people may have forgotten, because it's been a while since, almost 10 years now since he resigned. Next month will be 10 years since he resigned from the papacy. Then of course his resignation. And I think maybe that's what he'll be remembered for.
Well, he's the first pope to resign in 600 years, right? So that I think that's a big one. And not knowing that a pope could resign, especially after seeing JP2 and live through the suffering that JP2 lived with. I mean, his mind was still there, but being able to communicate and being able to actually move about. Like, I remember hearing stories about how JP2 used to go jogging through the villages that he would be visiting and stuff. Like, he'd just go jogging. And then to the point of what I remember seeing him as in the wheelchair and hardly being able to talk, and him getting frustrated over his words. You see that, and then you see Pope Benedict, for the first time in 600 years, decide to retire. To resign. And then okay, what do we do with two popes now? Like, how do we? But it was, I think he was probably one of the best people in our past that could have done that and done it as graciously as he did, and then not steal the spotlight. I mean, people always tried to. The other pope said this. You know what I mean? Like they tried to do that, but a lot of times Pope Benedict didn't necessarily step out and say things, like didn't try to overcorrect or try to that you did see a lot of times that the popes were on the same page for most things. There were a few things that kind of came out or that people like to claim in the news and media to kind of twist words and stuff. But other than that, like for the most part,
Oh yeah.
And like, think of it: if you were Pope Francis, you now have a living successor. A living
Predecessor.
a mentor,
Yeah.
a predecessor. Yeah, thank you. A mentor that you could kind of like. Okay, there's nobody else that has this stress or this position in the world. I got to rely completely on God. And now there is one other person. Like the other person that understands what this position is and what the room of tears really means.
I think that's worth noting, Josh, because some people, it's just natural to pit. It's like you pit one parent versus the other.
Yeah.
But I say like grace on both of their ends.
Yeah.
I think Pope Benedict slipped out of the spotlight gracefully,
Mm-hmm.
but Pope Francis also was graceful in the fact like he visited Pope Benedict,
Constantly
he
including him,
included him in major events and things like that. So it wasn't like you're banished or
No.
this awkwardness. I think both of them were very graceful, and I think the fraternity there was something beautiful to see. We're running out of time here, but one more thing before we close up this episode is that there is a lot of talk about will Pope Benedict be made a doctor of the church. And a doctor of the church is someone whose intellectual writings have contributed to the thought of the church, right? And so this is the question now. People are saying, well, he's going to be our doctor of the church. What do you think about that?
I hope so, and I think so, because he was such a quiet figure, and because of all of the other stuff you associate with Pope, you can miss the fact that he was arguably like the preeminent theologian of the 20th century.
Yeah.
That like his command of scripture, his command of philosophy, ancient and modern. It's actually JP2's biographer was talking about a lot of his conversations with Benedict, and he was saying that like you could ask a question and he would respond in like full, complete paragraphs in his third or fourth language. That is like the intellectual capacity that he had was often downplayed by his humble demeanor. But like as an intellectual, as someone who contributed substantially to the thought of the church, which is what a doctor of the church is, it's hard to find someone comparable.
The powerhouse that he was.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
There are currently 37 doctors of the church. Four of them are women and 33 are men, and they span, of course, the course of church history. Now, for Pope Benedict to be named a doctor of the church, I believe he's got to be named a saint first, right? And usually that there's a requirement typically to wait at least 5 years before a cause for sainthood can be opened. However, Pope Benedict waived that for
JP2.
Pope John Paul II. So, but in the life of the church, like today we kind of live in this world where things happen really fast. Where like canonizations of saints have taken centuries.
And there's an aspect of due process there as well.
Exactly.
It's not like a popularity contest or
exactly. Just because he was a popular person or something. Yeah,
exactly.
But I was gonna say he lives in the spotlight. Meaning, as a pope, one of the things nowadays, there's very little. Like at one time, you didn't get news from Rome for months at a time as they traveled over on a boat and everything else. And then with the advancement of technology, a lot of everything is spotlight. Everything is now. Everything is immediate. And so it's hard to hide scandal, hard to hide things that you'd be looking for in a canonization. Like, was everything that we know about them right? Was everything? And then you have the miracles that are associated with sainthood as well. But I believe that becoming pope is actually one of them. I don't, meaning I have to go back on that. I know that starting an order, it can be considered a miracle. But like if you need 2 miracles to become a saint, I think becoming pope and then I'll have to look at that to be 100% sure. But
do.
I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure it is. And that was one of the things with JP2 was talking about becoming like becoming to that position was and so then there's lots of miracles after that. So I'm excited to see what kind of happens in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're called to as Catholics, is to pray for the repose of the soul of Pope Benedict XVI, and to, I think we're just starting to unpack the legacy of Pope Benedict XVI. In a way, it's like, we've had Pope Benedict as emeritus Pope for the last 9 years, and, now we're again starting to pay attention to his writings and things. Of course, that's natural after someone passes away. So there's lots of things that we can unpack in the future. So we continue to read about him. We continue to be grateful to God for the leadership that he has given our church. And we continue to pray for him, that the Lord welcomes him home. All right. So thanks for joining us on this episode of the Catholic Buzz podcast. If you have any questions or comments for us, you can email us at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com. And for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on the Catholic Buzz.